I was thrown out while carrying a life inside me, but I didn't break. I built a new one. Hello, my name is Emily Parker, and if you think marrying the man you love guarantees happiness, you haven't met his mother. I used to believe that love could conquer anything, that kindness could melt any wall, that if you gave your whole heart, someone would treasure it. I was so young, so naive. I came from a town so small you could cross it in 15 minutes, a place where neighbours brought soup when you were sick, and your secrets never lasted more than a Sunday. We didn't have much, but we had love, and I thought that was enough. My mum raised me alone. She worked 3 jobs and still managed to kiss my forehead every night, braid my hair every morning, and tell me I was enough. I believed her. I carried that belief like armour when I met Ryan Carter. He was everything I never thought I deserved. Tall, soft-spoken, educated. He had this calm that made me feel safe. He came to our town for a construction project, and one morning at the diner he smiled at me like I was the only person in the world. And that was it. I fell hard. We talked every day. He made me feel smart, seen, beautiful. Within 2 months, he proposed. I said yes without thinking. I didn't see red flags, only fairy tale colours. I packed my bags with trembling hands and moved to the city with him. A place where the buildings were tall and the people didn't make eye contact. Where I felt invisible. Until I stepped into his mother's house. Margaret Carter. Her name alone sounded cold. She didn't say hello, didn't hug me, didn't even look me in the eye. She stared at my suitcase, then at my shoes, then at Ryan, and said, "This is her." Not welcome to the family, not even a nod, just that. I stood there, forcing a smile, telling myself, give her time. She's just surprised. But that day was a preview of everything to come. She didn't like the way I talked, said my accent was unrefined. She didn't like my clothes, said I dressed like I was going to a flea market. She didn't like how I cut vegetables, how I folded laundry, how I breathed. And Ryan, he wasn't cruel, but he was quiet. When I tried to speak up, he'd take his mother's side, or worse, say nothing at all. I wanted to believe he was caught in the middle. But sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I was 25, pregnant, and already disappearing. I remember the day I found out I was expecting. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, holding that test with the 2 pink lines, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, and I smiled, despite everything. I thought maybe this would change things. Maybe a baby would melt Margaret's heart. Maybe she'd see me not as the poor country girl, but as the mother of her grandchild. I told her that same evening, over dinner, my voice trembling but hopeful. She looked at me, then at Ryan, then back at me, and said, "So you trapped him?" I felt my stomach drop. Ryan didn't defend me. He just said, "Mom, please." And that was it. I spent the next 2 weeks walking on eggshells, trying to stay out of her way, throwing up in silence, crying in the shower. One morning, while Ryan was at work, she stood in the kitchen doorway and said, "You need to leave. Today." I blinked. "What?" I said, "You need to go. You're not welcome here." "But I'm carrying your grandchild." "I don't care. You should have thought about that before crawling into my son's life." I packed in silence. She stood there watching me, arms crossed, a satisfied look on her face, as if throwing me out gave her peace. I left with a backpack, a baby growing inside me, and nowhere to go. I didn't cry. Not when she said the words, not when she slammed the door behind me, not even when I stood on the sidewalk holding my backpack and a plastic bag with my prenatal vitamins. But I cried the moment I realised I had no one to call. I stared at my phone. No siblings, no cousins nearby. My mum had passed away 2 years earlier. And Ryan didn't answer. I called 3 times, sent a text, and then I stopped. I wasn't going to beg. I sat on a bus bench until the sun began to set, my feet swollen, my heart empty. A woman walked by with a little boy holding a balloon. I pressed my hand to my stomach and whispered, "I'll protect you, no matter what." I found the cheapest motel that would take cash. The room smelled like smoke and bleach. The sheets were thin, the walls too close, but for that night, it was a castle. I curled up with my arms around my belly and told my baby stories about the life we'd build, even though I didn't believe a word. The next morning, I walked to the community centre. They pointed me to a women's shelter, but it was full. The lady at the desk gave me a flyer for a church food bank and a list of places that might hire without experience. That was my world now, starting over, from nothing. I got a job bussing tables at a diner, then cleaning offices at night. I saved every cent I could. I ate canned beans so I could afford prenatal checkups. The baby grew, I grew, not just in size, but in fight. I rented a tiny room above an old bakery run by a man named Mr. Lee. He didn't speak much English, but he gave me a discount and always left extra pastries outside my door. Sometimes kindness comes in the smallest paper bag. I kept working. Morning shifts, night shifts, weekend shifts. I fainted once, in the walk-in freezer. The manager didn't care. "Pregnant women have worked before," he said. I cried in silence and kept working. I counted every kick. I whispered to my baby while mopping floors. "We're going to make it," I'd say. "Just hang in there." One night, around 3 a.m, I woke up with a stabbing pain, my body trembling. I was only 7 months. I crawled down the stairs and banged on Mr. Lee's door. He called 911. The ambulance ride was a blur. I remember screaming, crying, praying, begging the baby to stay inside just a little longer. At the hospital, the doctor said I was at risk. Too much stress, too little rest. The baby might come early. I stayed there for a week. No visitors, no flowers. Just me. And the quiet sound of machines keeping watch over 2 hearts. But my boy held on. He was strong. So was I. When I was discharged, Mr. Lee drove me home in his beat-up truck. I had 3 missed calls from Ryan. I didn't call back. That chapter was over. The next 2 months, I walked slower, worked less, but never stopped. I stitched baby clothes out of old shirts, wrote letters to my future son, folded diapers in neat stacks on the tiny shelf above my bed. And then, one cold morning, he came. Noah, my Noah. He was small but fierce. His cry filled that little room like a symphony. And in that moment, I became a mother, a real one. Not perfect, not ready, but real. I held him close and made a silent promise that no matter what the world took from us, I would give him everything I had left. There's something no one tells you about rock bottom. It's not a single moment. It's a slow, quiet sinking, like standing in quicksand with a smile, pretending you're fine, while everything you once believed in disappears beneath your feet. After Noah was born, I thought the hardest part was over, but survival is never a straight line. There were nights I held him while he cried for hours, and I cried too, but in silence, so he wouldn't feel my fear. My milk didn't come easily. The formula was expensive. Sometimes I drank tap water and skipped meals so I could feed him. I used to think hunger was just an ache in the stomach. But it's not. It's a fog. It makes you forget how to dream. The bakery above which we lived kept us warm. But winter was harsh. The heater broke twice, and Mr. Lee couldn't afford to fix it right away. I wrapped Noah in 3 layers of blankets, held him against my chest, and rocked him back and forth, whispering the stories about sunshine and summer. We'll have a garden one day, I told him, with tomatoes and mint and a swing tied to an old oak tree. He didn't understand, but I needed to believe it for both of us. I worked again 2 weeks after giving birth. My body wasn't ready, but the bills didn't care. I wore second-hand shoes too tight for my swollen feet, cleaned office floors while bleeding, smiled at customers who never looked me in the eyes. But every night when I got home, I kissed Noah's forehead and whispered, "We made it through another day." I remember one evening. I came home with frostbitten fingers and there was no power. Mr. Lee had left a candle outside my door and a note in broken English. "I sorry. No light tonight. You strong." I lit the candle, held Noah close, and cried until my chest ached. Not because of pain, but because someone believed I was strong when I felt anything but. Some days I thought of giving up, just walking into the night and never coming back. But then I'd see Noah's tiny fingers grip mine, and I remembered I wasn't alone. One morning, at the bus stop, I overheard 2 women talking about a job opening, somewhere called Rivers Natural Goods. I wrote it down on a crumpled receipt and went there the next day, wearing my only clean blouse and too much hope. The receptionist barely looked at me. "We're not hiring right now," she said. But just as I turned to leave, an older woman collapsed in the lobby. People screamed. I didn't think. I just ran. I held her head up, checked her breathing, called 911, covered her with my coat. Her hand clutched mine as if it were the only thing keeping her here. When the ambulance came, a man rushed in, tall, well-dressed, panicked. "Mum!" he cried. I stood up slowly. He looked at me, and everything changed. That man was Daniel Rivers, the owner of the company, and the woman I helped was his mother. The next day, I got a call. He asked to meet. I expected a thank you, but he offered me a job. "We need someone in packaging," he said. "You showed up at the right moment." I didn't ask questions. I just said yes. And that's how I started over, again. In a warehouse with paper cuts and sticky labels, surrounded by strangers. But for the first time in years, I felt seen. Daniel didn't talk much, but he noticed things, like how I always stayed late, how I brought Noah in his stroller when I couldn't afford a sitter, how I returned every compliment with a quiet "thank you" and nothing more. He never pitied me. He just gave me chances, and I grabbed them with both hands. Slowly, I rose, from packaging to inventory, then to shift supervisor. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. For every insult Margaret had thrown, every time Ryan looked away, I had something now they couldn't take from me: self-worth. One night, after a long shift, Daniel offered to drive me home. I hesitated. He smiled. "It's just a ride, Emily." On the way, we didn't talk much. Just music and comfort. When we stopped in front of the bakery, he glanced at the old building and asked, "Is this where you live?" "Yeah," I said, embarrassed. "It's not much." "No," he interrupted. "It's everything. Because you built your life from here. I didn't say anything, but something in me cracked open that night. Maybe, just maybe, rock bottom was behind me. Hope doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it slips into your life wearing the face of a stranger, disguised as coincidence, hidden in the quiet moments when you almost give up. I never expected the job at Rivers Natural Goods to change my life. At first, it was just a paycheck. Packaging lotions and essential oils into boxes wasn't glamorous, but it was clean work, steady hours, and people actually said thank you. That was new to me. On my first day, I kept my head down, worked hard, and tried not to be noticed. I had become used to being invisible. Blending in was safer. But Daniel, he noticed. Not in a loud or intrusive way, just small glances when I lifted a box too heavy, or soft pauses when our hands brushed at the supply table. He had this quiet energy, calm but aware, like someone who had seen both pain and grace. He never asked about my past, never looked at me like a charity case. He just let me work. And slowly, I remembered what it felt like to be treated with dignity. I brought Noah with me sometimes, when I couldn't find anyone to watch him. I'd park his stroller in the corner of the break room with a bottle, a stuffed elephant, and a blanket. Every few hours, I'd check in, kiss his chubby cheeks, and whisper, "Mama's right here." One day, I found a folded note next to his stroller. "He has your eyes, beautiful and full of fight. De." I smiled, and for the first time in a long time, it wasn't forced. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. I was promoted to inventory coordinator, then assistant floor manager. It wasn't luck. It was sweat, grit, and staying late when everyone else clocked out. At night, when Noah slept, I studied business articles online. I watched videos on supply chain management. I read case studies on organic branding. Something inside me had reawakened. Not just the need to survive, but the hunger to build. I started sketching ideas, logos, names. Noah Organics was born in a dollar store notebook, drawn with a broken pencil. I imagined products with ingredients I used myself: aloe, oatmeal, lavender, things that healed gently. On my lunch breaks, I saved samples from returned products, took them home, experimented. I blended oils in mason jars, measured out wax, tested scents on my own skin. I burned myself, ruined a few towels, but each failure taught me something. And Daniel, he noticed again. One evening, he stayed behind to lock up and found me alone in the break room, mixing a small jar of hand balm. He didn't interrupt, just watched for a while, then said, "You're building something, aren't you?" I froze. "I'm just curious," I mumbled. He smiled. "Curious people change the world." A few days later, he left a book on my desk, The Lean Startup. No note, just a subtle nudge. I read it in 2 nights. Something shifted in me after that. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was dreaming again. I talked to local vendors, researched sourcing laws, built a spreadsheet of costs. I pitched the idea to a local farmer's market and got my first yes. I cried in the bathroom for 15 minutes. When I told Daniel, he nodded like he'd known all along. "Do you need anything?" he asked. I hesitated. "No, I want to build this myself." He respected that, but he made a few calls behind my back anyway. Introduced me to a graphic designer friend, helped me lease a small workshop space, showed up on opening day with a bouquet of lavender. "You've got this," he said with that steady voice. I had never had someone believe in me like that. Not Ryan, not Margaret, not even my own reflection. But Daniel did, and somehow That helped me believe too. The workshop was tiny, just a corner room with creaky floors and peeling paint. But to me, it was sacred. It was where my life split in two. The girl who had begged for shelter, and the woman who now created something of her own. Noah would sit in a playpen while I poured balms, labelled jars, and packed orders late into the night. Sometimes I'd stop and just watch him sleep, whispering, "This is all for you." And then came the moment I'll never forget. The day I signed the lease for my first real storefront. It was a cosy space on a quiet street, next to an old brick house with green shutters and a front porch. I didn't notice the address at first. I was too busy imagining shelves of handmade products and warm lights and music floating through the air. But on move-in day, when I stepped outside to take a call, I looked next door and froze. It was Margaret Carter's house, the very house that had once spit me out like I was filth. My heart pounded, my knees went weak. Fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. I almost walked away. But then I thought of all the nights I'd cried in silence, all the times I'd gone hungry so Noah could eat, all the hours I'd spent building this dream, and I looked up at that house, the past, and whispered, "Watch me now." I never planned to build an empire. I just wanted safety. A place where my son could grow without fear, without hunger, without hearing his mother cry behind bathroom doors. But sometimes, the things you build out of desperation become the strongest parts of you. Noah Organics started small, so small I could carry all my inventory in 2 cardboard boxes. My first customers were local mums, street vendors, and 2 kind yoga instructors who posted my lip balm on Instagram. I hand-poured every product, wrapped each order with recycled ribbon, and signed my name on thank you notes with ink-stained fingers. Every time someone bought a jar, I whispered, "Thank you," not just for the sale, but for seeing me, believing in what I made with my own hands. Daniel kept his distance professionally, but I saw it in his eyes. He was proud, not because he helped me, but because I did it myself. The storefront next to Margaret's house was more than just a coincidence. It was a mirror held up to my past. Every morning, I walked past the same porch where she once stood, arms crossed, lips curled, judging me like dirt under her shoe. And now, she watched me from behind lace curtains. I caught her sometimes, eyes peeking through the blinds, like a ghost from another life. But I didn't flinch. I had nothing to prove. My success was not revenge. It was survival and rebirth. The grand opening was quiet, but beautiful. Friends from the farmer's market came. Daniel sent a bouquet of mint and lavender with a card that said, "The roots are deep now." I wore my mother's brooch, the one she gave me before she passed. Noah held the scissors with me as we cut the ribbon. That night, I sat alone in the store after everyone left, lights dim, boxes empty, heart full. I ran my hand over the wooden counter and whispered, "We did it, baby. We really did it." In the following weeks, customers came slowly. Some just browsed. Some asked for free samples. Some told me I'd never last in a neighborhood like this. But I smiled, offered them tea, and kept going. One afternoon, as I was arranging a display of soaps, the bell over the door rang, and in walked Ryan. I hadn't seen him in years. He looked older, thinner, like a man who'd learned too late what he once had. "Emily," he said, as if tasting the name for the first time. I stood still, the peppermint soap still in my hand. "Ryan," I said quietly. "Your shop looks amazing," he offered. "Thank you," He looked around, then asked, "Can we talk?" I paused, looked at the door, then back at him. "There's nothing left to say." He looked wounded. "I made mistakes." "Yes," I nodded. "You did. Do you think maybe we could start over?" I took a breath. "No, Ryan. I don't live there anymore. That girl, the one who waited for your love, who begged for your defense, she's gone." He left without another word, and I stood there, stronger than I ever thought I could be. The next day, Margaret came. She didn't come in, just stood at the edge of the sidewalk, staring. Her eyes didn't hold hatred this time, only something quieter, like confusion or regret. She didn't speak, and I didn't wave. Some wounds don't need closure, they just need distance. My business grew, word of mouth, loyal customers, small online orders. Every night I closed the shop, locked the door, kissed Noah's sleepy forehead, then laughed and said, "We're home." Not just in a physical space, but in a life I built, brick by brick, scar by scar, with no help from the people who broke me. This wasn't just my store, it was my empire. And I had built it from nothing, except the will to never be small again. I didn't plan it. I didn't move next door to make a point. I didn't build a business to throw it in anyone's face. But fate has its own strange sense of timing. And when the day came, grand opening, gold ribbon, smiling customers, my son holding my hand, I saw her, Margaret Carter, standing on her porch like a statue carved from cold stone, eyes locked on mine, mouth slightly parted. The look on her face, it wasn't anger or pride or even shock. It was something else, something like disbelief meeting guilt in a room full of ghosts. I held her gaze, not to challenge her, not to hurt her, but to say with silence alone, "I am not the girl you threw away. I have become everything you thought I never could be." People clapped as we cut the ribbon. Noah laughed. My name was printed on the banner in gold script. Founder Emily Parker. I wore a white blouse, the same shade as the dress she once said made me look cheap. But today I stood tall, radiant, untouchable. She didn't come in, she just stood there, watching. Maybe trying to understand how the girl she once deemed worthless now ran a company within breathing distance of her living room. Ryan came out a moment later, stood beside her. He looked smaller, as if time had worn down the edges of his pride. He held her elbow like a fragile vase. She didn't shake him off. Maybe she needed him now, in ways she never needed me. And that was justice enough. I finished the opening ceremony with a speech, short, honest. I said, "This store was born from the things I once thought would destroy me. Heartbreak, rejection, silence. But sometimes rock bottom is the most fertile soil, because when you're buried, you learn to grow." After the applause, I stepped inside and closed the door. Behind it, the hum of quiet peace. In front of it, the past. The next morning, I opened early. The shop smelled of lavender and lemon. I was rearranging the body oils when I heard the bell. And there she was, Margaret, in my store. She walked in slowly like someone trespassing in a cathedral. She didn't look at the products, didn't touch anything. She just walked up to the counter and stood there. I waited. She looked at me, eyes tired, voice low. "It's beautiful." I said nothing. She glanced around, swallowed hard, then added, I never imagined. I didn't fill in the silence. I wanted her to sit with it. After a pause, she asked, Would you ever consider coming back? I tilted my head slightly. To what? She blinked. The family? Ryan? I smiled. Not cruel, just final. No, Margaret. I'm not coming back. Because I never belonged there. I don't fit inside a life that made me shrink to survive. Her lips parted, but no words came. I stepped around the counter and stood in front of her. I forgive you, I said. But that doesn't mean I forget. And it doesn't mean I return. Her eyes shimmered, just a little. Then she turned and walked out. I watched her go, not as an enemy, but as a memory I'd finally released. I didn't win today because I hurt her. I won because I no longer needed her approval to feel whole. That was the look on her face. And this was the freedom on mine. They say every story has an ending, but I've come to believe some stories don't end. They evolve, shift, bloom into something new. For years, I thought closure meant returning to the past, standing face to face with what broke me and demanding justice. But I was wrong. Closure is not confrontation. It's liberation. It's waking up one morning and realizing you're no longer waiting for an apology. That was the morning I understood what healing truly meant. It had nothing to do with Margaret, or Ryan, or anyone else. It had everything to do with me. It started in small ways. I stopped flinching at the sound of the front bell. I stopped checking the blinds to see if she was watching. I stopped rehearsing imaginary conversations where I told her everything she should have heard. I started smiling at my reflection. I started planting basil in the little window box. I started calling Noah's giggle my favourite sound in the world, and slowly, happiness didn't feel like a stranger. It felt like coming home. My days became full, orders to pack, customers to greet, laughter echoing in the back room as Noah coloured next to the shelves. He loved the shop. He'd named the soaps. This one is Cloud Soap, and this one is Dragonfire. His drawings lined the back office wall. Some days, Daniel came by just to read with him while I restocked shelves. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. That was the real gift. Love that didn't ask me to shrink, or soften, or explain, just to exist. One Thursday afternoon, as rain tapped the windows, Noah curled in Daniel's lap with a book. I stood behind the counter, watching them, and something inside me softened. I didn't cry. I just breathed. For the first time in years, deeply. That weekend, we took a trip to the park. A simple picnic. Sandwiches, juice, laughter, and when Daniel reached for my hand, I didn't pull away. Not because I needed him to, but because I wanted to share the life I had built. We sat on the grass, watching Noah chase butterflies, and Daniel asked, "Do you ever think about what might have been?" I smiled. Sometimes, but then I look at this moment, and I don't want to trade it for anything. He nodded. That's when you know you're free. That night, I pulled out my old notebook, the one where I first scribbled the name Noah Organics. I flipped through the pages, saw all the crossed out ideas, the shaky sketches, the hopes written in between exhaustion, and I whispered, "Thank you," to the version of me who never gave up. I began writing again, new ideas, new goals. I didn't just want to survive anymore. I wanted to thrive, to lead, to mentor. I reached out to a nonprofit helping single mothers start businesses. I offered free workshops, product samples, and my story. The first time I stood in front of that group, dozens of tired, beautiful women, I said, "You are not broken, you are building." They cried, I cried, then we laughed. That night I went home, held Noah close, and said, "Your mama is a builder." And he replied, "I know, you build soap and love." That's when I knew I had already won. Not because I was wealthy, not because I proved anyone wrong, but because I had become someone I would have looked up to when I was at my worst. The next spring, the city held a small business fair. They invited me to speak. As I stood on stage, I spotted Margaret in the back. She didn't approach, didn't wave, she just listened. Her eyes softer, her mouth no longer pursed in judgment. That was enough. That night, Noah asked me, "Mum, do we live in a castle?" I laughed. "Not quite, sweet pea. Why?" "Because it feels like one." I kissed his forehead. "Then maybe we do." And in that moment, I realized this was my castle, my shop, my child, my freedom, my peace, my voice, my ending, and my beginning. This wasn't a fairy tale, no prince, no carriage, no rescue, just a woman who learned how to rescue herself and teach her son that strength comes from rising again and again. So yes, this is my happy ending, not because everything is perfect, but because I finally wrote the ending myself. If you found this story captivating, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you've just heard is only the beginning. There are still so many secrets, so many untold truths waiting to be revealed. And I'll be the one to take you deep into every story. Thank you for listening.